Welcome, everybody. I'm super thrilled to be hosting or moderating this panel session. As Michelle said, we're going to be covering some big, hairy questions around building a world-class ecosystem to address the climate and human health crisis. Before we jump into it, however, I'd like to invite our panelists to spend 2 or 3 minutes and just introduce themselves and their organizations, and we'll kick off. Maybe we'll start with Todd.
Perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a privilege to be here with fellow panelists, as well as the audience. I'm really looking forward to our dialogue as we get going. My name is Todd Sayers. I'm with the BC Centre for Innovation and Clean Energy. CICE, or CICE, CICE is a unique, it's formed by private and public dollars, so industry and government coming together to really scale early stage climate solutions and clean energy solutions. And we do that across 4 strategic areas: low carbon hydrogen solutions, battery and energy storage, carbon management overall, which is really needed, as well as low carbon fuels. So we have a theory of change where we have a small amount of resources, but we really use that to attract a conversation, and working with academia and industry and government and other experts to really define the problem, what is needed. And that's one of the conversations I want to come back to today on our ability to really get to results faster, is to make sure we're all aiming at where the need is. And then we provide, and we like to lead that financing, that non-dilutive financing, really early stage, to help scale some of those solutions. And so we can be candidates for Leah when she introduces herself. In fact, we are going to help the entrepreneurship programs at UBC, UBCO, UVic, SFU, and UNBC coming up in the next few months to really advance student entrepreneurs' ideas in the climate space as well, to unlock innovation in that space. So that's a little bit about CIC, but yeah, I'll talk a little bit more about what we do as we get into the panel discussions. But great to be here, and look forward to the two-way conversation. Thanks, Sean.
Fantastic. Ali, over to you. And I guess you've got 2 different organizations you can speak to.
Sure. Well, today, as my capacity, first of all, thank you for having me here. And great to be amongst a fantastic audience. My name is Ali Ordekani, and I'm the chair of Life Sciences BC, which is actually by the number of members, Canada's largest life science organization. We have a membership of over 300 organizations, which include universities, academic institutions, research institutions, hospitals, as well as biotech and pharmaceutical companies, medical devices, digital health, and service providers. And our vision is to enable innovation by bringing all of these key players together. I also run a small fund and an advisory company called Novature Ventures. My background is I've worked both in biotech and medical devices over the last 20 years, been an operator, founder, and been through a number of journeys, which I'm looking forward to sharing with you today, and giving you some of our perspective on how innovation in climate and innovation in healthcare impact each other.
Thanks, Ali. And last but not least, Leah.
Hi, everyone. Echoing their comments, really happy to be here today. The light is a little bit blinding, so hard to see everyone in the crowd, but great to have you all here as well. So I'm the Chief Investment Officer for NBC. We're a provincial crown corporation, so what that means is we're taxpayer funded, and we're a $500 million investment fund, where our goal is to invest with a triple bottom line mandate of people, planet, and profit. So if you like to read legislation, there's an act, the NBC Investment Act, and it actually spells out that we are to invest to drive financial returns as well as social, environmental, and economic benefits for the province. And so how we've interpreted that is 4 key impact objectives that we look to invest across. So driving climate action, advancing reconciliation, innovating for the future, and enabling inclusive communities. And what that means is we really want to help invest in companies and opportunities that will help to address these challenges for BC and for the world, and how do we help to scale and provide the capital that they need in order to grow it and and tackle these solutions. So we're an investment fund, and what I love here is that we have different parts of the ecosystem really coming together to talk about how, as a collective, we can help build this innovation system, because it's not just about one player or one person doing it. It really is a whole village to make that happen.
Wonderful. Thanks, Leah. And for the audience, this is an unscripted conversation. We met last week and talked about the panel. There was a lot of energy in the call that we had. It's unscripted. I haven't provided the panelists with a list of questions. We want this to be really interactive. We want this to involve you and have your questions being posed to the panel. We can guess at what you'd like to hear about and the questions you'd like to ask, but please populate Slido with those questions, because we want to make it as interactive and make it more of a conversation. So with that, maybe let me kick off. As Michelle noted, the topic or the title of the panel is Building a World-Class Ecosystem to Address the Climate and Human Health Crises. So I'm going to ask a really big question. Is our ecosystem, we do have a long history of producing both successful global leaders and companies in human health and in clean tech. But I want to ask our panelists, is our ecosystem really ready to sustain BC as a global hub for innovation? If so, why do you think that is? And if not, tell us why you think that might be. And I'm going to open up the floor. Would someone like to kick off the conversation?
Sure, I'll kick it off. I would say yes, but.
Very Canadian answer.
Right?
Yep.
Exactly.
Just don't say sorry.
Well, it's coming up. I think there's all the ingredients are there. There's always more than we could do. And so that's kind of the perspective that I bring to it. I've kind of been in this space for about 5 months now, so I do have a new perspective, and I'm learning today on my blind spots as well. But I think the skill of innovating and building that into part of our life's work and part of education. It's interesting when you engage with climate tech entrepreneurs in BC. You know, when people have ideas or have started companies, it's like their 5th idea or iteration. And that to me says there's a lot of health in this ecosystem. And the network is actually small, and that's why it's so important for places like CICE to support that early stage company, as even though technology may be proven, may be tested, may not commercially scale initially, we know we're seeding the ground for future innovation that's absolutely needed. So I do think that part of the but is there's more we can do as an ecosystem together to figure out where do we lead and where do we participate. So there are so many people in the ecosystem. I think there's more, and even engagements like this. I haven't met Leah and Ali before. How else can we understand what each of us is good at, and what else we're planning to do to figure out how we can collaborate to have more impact. That's including with universities, governments. I think that's an expectation everyone has of us, and it's an expectation we should have of each other to continue to do more in that space. So that's my, no sorries, but that's my Canadian answer yet.
Fantastic.
I think that's a really good perspective. I'm going to be a little bit of contrarian. I don't think we are as ready as we think, and it has nothing to do with British Columbia. Actually, British Columbia has a lot of fantastic elements. I think the way we reward ventures, whether it's a new startup in healthcare or climate, it's crisis-driven. So think about it. Right now, if I can tell you something if I tell you that I've got this innovation that can prevent you getting cancer, it's very difficult to get it funded because it's very difficult to prove. But if I can come and tell you that I've got this potentially new cancer drug that can extend your life at your terminal stage by 3 months, that drug is going to get funded and sells $1 billion. So that's it. Unfortunately, and same thing with healthcare. We've got climate crisis, and now we're looking at reducing carbon emissions or carbon capturing technologies. Whereas, can we start changing that dynamic or changing our view to look at how can we come up with ventures and ideas and actually rewarding those ideas where we can actually address them before we actually addressing crisis and acute points. The other thing is we work in silos. You've got climate experts looking at climate from one angle. You've got health experts or health innovation experts, and I can say, I don't know much about climate, but they're completely interrelated. And how we treat our climate is going to impact our healthcare, and the other way around. So we need more interdisciplinary groups that come together and innovations that address multiple things. Think about it. Our economy is rated on GDP, gross domestic product, which is a completely outdated thing. It doesn't include healthcare, happiness, mental health, climate, all these things that are impacting everything else. I think we need more interdisciplinary ventures and a reward system for those so that we can bring them all together.
Yeah, so I'll be middle of the road on both sides here in the sense that I think...
Also very Canadian.
I'm also a middle child, so I think it just resonates, like very much so being in the middle here. I think they're both good points, right? Like I think, we have a lot of the pieces in place to enable us to be world-class, and we still need to assemble them in the most optimal way, right? Like I think, from a talent perspective, we have world-class research facilities and institutions. We have so much great talent. Capital is something, we're here to help build and further contribute. But we need all of these things coming together and working together, right? And I think, how do we take those ideas that are world-class but need that extra help to commercialize and scale, at the spectrum that Todd's talking about. But how do we also think about the intersectionality and interdependency of those things, right? So I loved having Lana talk about that because, the things that get funded aren't always the things that need to be funded. Not to say ED doesn't need to be funded, but I think equally we need to think about what are other solutions that need to be funded, right? And that's why, when we think about our mandate, it is how do we make sure we're seeing all these dots connecting and bringing them together? And then how do we help entrepreneurs and researchers and innovators navigate that pathway? Because it's hard if you don't come from this world and you think about all the lingo and jargon and speak, right? Like we as a whole innovation ecosystem are still quite nascent and early in our journey relative to a Silicon Valley or other more mature markets, right? And so how do we break down these silos? How do we come together in a more meaningful way? So for example, yesterday, the Capital Compass for BC was announced and released. So that's in collaboration with Innovate BC, InBC, Pacifican, and New Ventures BC. But it's a tool that's meant to help entrepreneurs better understand what are the options out there, how do I figure out what I need, and also what are the dilutive and non-dilutive options that exist. Because venture capital isn't necessarily what you need at all times, but people don't know that because when you hear in the media and these mega funding rounds and all the things, sometimes that's what people think they need, but that might not always be depending on what stage of growth you're at.
Wonderful. Fantastic. That was really insightful from the three of you. Thank you very much. I actually heard some themes, some commonality across the three answers, although the answers were across the spectrum. So we've got the ecosystem is ready, yes, but we've got some elements. Ali's saying no, the incentive system is potentially broken, or it's not broken, but it doesn't favor breaking down silos and I guess viewing the long game. So that's and then of course we've got InBC, which has a novel mandate from the government and doesn't function necessarily like a traditional venture capital funder. So I'd like to pull at that a little more, or tug at that a little more. So what needs to change in the way we approach how we measure success from a funding perspective or a resource perspective, where the traditional venture funding approach is, needing an exit in 5 to 7 years and so on and so forth. What needs to change?
Can I go first?
Absolutely.
I have lots of thoughts on this. So, a big part of it is when we think about, just going back to like Econ 101 or Economics 101, right? Like you talk about externalities, right? And a lot of how the reward systems are based right now are just on the financial benefits. They're not taking into account the externalities, whether they're positive or negative, right? And that's a huge part of the challenges we're facing today is we aren't taking those into account in terms of, how we're rewarding people, how we're placing valuations and things like that. And so there's a whole school of thought around impact investing. So how do you think about embedding not just the financial elements, but also the social, environmental, or other impact and outcomes that you're trying to drive, so that you can have a more holistic way of looking at that. So, for example, with our investments, yes, we look at financial returns, but we also look at, if you're going to be something driving climate action, how are you meaningfully making an impact in terms of greenhouse gas emissions or waste reduction, right? If you are elevating inclusive communities, right? How are you truly solving problems for communities that historically have not had the same access to capital or investment, right? And how is that baked into the core of your business model? And I think there's this panel later today that Kukai and a few of the other impact investors are on that talks about that. So highly encourage, if you want to understand a bit more about that, to join that panel, because that's what they're dedicated to speaking about. But it's really about how do you price in all of these externalities, whether they're negative or positive, so that when you're looking at it, you're looking at the long-term view of it, not just the short-term immediate financial aspect of it, because that's going to reward the longer-term behavior in terms of how you think about building your business if you're an entrepreneur, right? If your board and your investors only care about the focus on getting sales, that's going to drive a different mentality than if they're thinking about, okay, your sales have to tie back to your core mission, which is reducing greenhouse gas emissions in a meaningful way. Right? That changes how you think about building your business and how you orient, how you operate, how you go to market, how you build your team culture, how you hire, all of those things all tie together.
Fantastic. Something I want to come back to in what you just said, but I wanted to talk to Todd or Ali.
Yeah,
anything to add there?
Exactly. That's incentives. So think about it. Incentives come two ways for you to create a new venture, right? One is market incentives. So you build something and you know people will buy it. So Tesla took care of that, right? Tesla took advantage of saying, I'm going to create a business around being electric cars. But governments boosted that incentive, or actually advocated that incentive, by adding all sorts of rebates. And we saw when Premier Ford took away the rebates in electric cars, their sales went down. So government plays a key role in policy. And we need more dialogue with different government stakeholders around, whether it's provincial, federal, and US, because government's policies impact business. So I love what you said, because a lot of times as an investor, we don't look at, we have our own stakeholders that look at that ROI. But if there are other, incentives where policies can impact how something is measured, it's more than that ROI or IRR on a number on a balance sheet. It's actually the impact of how does this impact healthcare and climate. If you're looking at a technology that can only impact climate but doesn't have the angle of healthcare or the other way around, I think that's a problem. You need to see if you can actually look at a number of different angles and incentivize those.
Yeah, just to echo what my panelists, I completely agree. I think, so I'm kind of wired to, well, what can we do? What is the next step? What's the action? And from, you're right, aligning the decisions and reconstructing capitalism is, we're not going to get there immediately, and this is the challenge that industry struggles with too in clean tech solutions. But at the most rudimentary level, it's being aware of your blind spots and making sure you're bringing those perspectives into your early decision making, right? I just learned about femtech today, right? Until you know about what your blind spots are. So you need to be able to ask the question as you're going through developing companies and ideas, what am I missing? How much is confirmation bias kind of clouding my own, because I have so much passion and I've been attached to this idea. And then it's getting challenged from, socializing it and having those venues. So I think, what can I do? Getting the right perspectives. What can CIC, the Center for Innovation in Clean Energy, do? Convening these thought sessions, right, of bringing people together. So we have, amongst our themes, we use intelligence to define what we think the problems are, and then we convene people, experts in different areas, and Chatham House rules, this is what we think the problem is. What are the perspectives we're missing? That, to me, can even make a step change in starting to align the incentives around how we're designing the decision process.
And maybe to jump in before you
absolutely.
move to your next question.
Keep going.
I think your point, Todd, I think really speaks to the importance of having different people at the table and having that conversation and understanding, okay, what are those potential blind spots, right? So I know, in some ways, DEI feels like it's just a woke tool, but the reality is when you have different people with different lived experiences coming together to, talk through challenges, it really opens your eyes to what's actually there versus just your own biases, right? Like I remember talking to another investor about a company that was a BIPOC founder, and they were having trouble finding $25,000, and the other investor was like, why don't they just ask their friends and family? And my parents were refugee immigrants, right? I'm like, not everyone has friends and family that can loan you $25,000. That's kind of a reality, right? But and it was no malice on that person's part. That was just not the reality that they lived, right? And so it's so key as we're talking about this and having, the interdisciplinary conversations, as Ali was saying, is you have to surround yourself with people, not just who look different than you, but have different life experiences or think differently than you, because it allows you to actually see those blind spots in a meaningful way.
Wonderful. Todd,
and that is what BC has. BC has those perspectives, right? And so maybe talk about the secret sauce of an ecosystem. Like that's been my experience. It's amazing. We just have to have time to get out and understand them more. But those ingredients are here.
I completely agree. Absolutely. I'm going to come back to the question around diversity and inclusivity because it's near and dear to our hearts at entrepreneurship at UBC. I want to just go back to some of the conversation we were having around policy and policy influencers. In the organizations that you're involved in, you've got access to big industry, to funders and other members of Life Sciences BC, for example, and of course, venture capital as well as government. So what are you hearing from those constituents? Are they asking, what am I trying to say? Are they, what sort of policy direction or what direction are they asking for on policies that would potentially influence the strength or the building of the ecosystem?
I can speak to that maybe first. So it's very interesting because I would say until before COVID, we had a hard time communicating what life sciences is to the provincial government. Actually, they didn't know what is life sciences. How do you define it? Is it ag bio? Is it environmental? Is it new therapeutics? And it actually was COVID that really highlighted what is it that we do. All these people in white labs and in venture funds investing and the RNA technology that Peter Cullis has been developing was started 40 years ago, and it struggled in many different iterations, and it really took a crisis for different stakeholders to understand. I mean, not everybody knew what RNA is. Now everybody knows it. Anybody who took the vaccine knows what an mRNA is because that was part of the innovation that came out of UBC. So a big part of policy is education. You need the government and other stakeholders to understand what you do and appreciate it. And once that got going, we started seeing collaboration amongst Life Sciences BC and 3 different ministries in provincial government, something that I personally hadn't seen. I mean, I joined the board in 2017, last 6 years. Unbelievable. And they've been able to enable funding in biomanufacturing, talent, education, and all sorts of other things, and open dialogue. In fact, the collaboration was so significant that we gave an award in our reception a couple of weeks ago for Partner of the Year. So to me, if you want your stakeholders to understand, it just takes tremendous amount of education so they actually understand your impact. But I can also say they saw the monetary impact. I think when AbCellera started selling COVID drugs, they actually realized that this is not some big pit in a hole that you just keep funding and these companies don't make money forever. There's actually revenue and there's job created, and these are high-paying jobs, and it's going to impact and put us on the map.
Wonderful. Anything to add, Todd or Leah?
Yeah, I mean, we were created from policy. Like, that was our origin story, right? And it was because, during the pandemic, there was this need that the government saw, and how do we build back the economy, but also build it back in a way that allows us to be stronger, more resilient, and take into account all those things around, the crises that you talk about in terms of health, but environmental crises that have really coalesced over the last few decades, right? And so this is our chance to be able to, translate that policy into something, into industry and into venture capital in order to fuel those, right? And it really is that partnership between public and private that allows us to grow our ecosystem in a meaningful way.
Yeah, just to add on that, so our experience, so the provincial government is one of our 3 founding members, part of, also created during COVID, part of it was to also build back and help implement Clean BC and a lot of the goals around that. We're not specifically a policy shop, but because we're prone to action in that early funnel activity, we have a lot of valid data points to help inform policy across, a number of ministries. And so we offer those up as like, here are the roadblocks for scaling certain solutions or certain industries in BC so that people can act on it, right? But there's definitely I think the energy is there for everyone involved to figure out how we can remove barriers. And part of that is us understanding what pieces of information we can contribute to those conversations, because they're ready to be had, and we just need to make sure we show up with some of the most tangible ones that are evidence-based that people can act on.
Love it. Fantastic. So that leads really nicely into diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I don't think anyone disputes the fact that the numbers are there to show that better and more optimal outcomes occur with diversity and inclusivity. Traditionally, startup ecosystems have been built on white male affluence, and they perpetuate white male affluence largely. And so I'm really interested in understanding how we ensure, as a pillar of a successful startup ecosystem, how do we ensure inclusivity and diversity within our ecosystem? And certainly, as Todd notes, the elements are all there. We live in BC, which is an incredibly diverse population. So how do we ensure that?
I'll go back to actions and behaviors that hold it up. And as leaders, and all of us as leaders in life and our own respective, it's to highlight where that's successful. So one of my fundamental beliefs is in the power of teams. I had probably about a decade ago in postgraduate work, it was it was all around high performing teams. And when you understand that the more perspectives you have, the outcome is always better than your individual perspective, it is mind-blowing, but it is true. And so it is inviting all of those perspectives in and understanding how, and being vulnerable to that existing, because there is a piece about that too. It's being aware that, and why I'm anxious to hear what the audience has to say, we don't have all the answers, but it's totally acceptable to say, this is my perspective, this is what I know, like what else am I missing, how can you help frame that? That's where leadership in this space and in these ecosystems needs to happen from my perspective.
I think it's more than just leadership. I think it needs to be mandated. I'll tell you, it's very difficult to just ask people to do it, because I think it wasn't until a couple of years ago where there was just this, stark realization that, at least in healthcare, I can speak to healthcare, 80% are white men, but they're developing over 65% or 70% of products are developed for women. And you think about that across, and you saw the statistics, which is perfect with Emma's presentation up there. The clinical trials are done on men, leadership is on men, boards were men, and you're developing product for women. And you go out there and you say, well, I want to have a diversified board. The first thing is, well, you're looking for those. It's not like they're lined up. It's just they haven't had the opportunity to come up and become a leader. And it's always, well, I want to do the right thing for my shareholders and my company. Well, okay, so how are you going to give that? It's like the guy who doesn't have a job experience, and you're like, well, I can't give you a job because you don't have experience. How is she going to ever get the opportunity to get on that board? So if it's mandated like California has, and I think that's really changed our industry now, that you need to have at least so many female, and you're rewarded somehow, I don't know, whatever we can come up with, to have diversity and inclusion. Otherwise, it's just not going to happen by itself.
I have lots of thoughts on this, but I think, in terms of what's actionable and what's realistic, I think first off, it's recognizing it's not about doing something at the expense of someone else, i.e. the white men, in order to enable more diversity, right? And I think that's the uncomfortable part for a lot of people, because it feels like, oh, but if we're gonna mandate this, then that means that I won't get my seat at the table anymore. I guess you guys won't get your seats at the table anymore, right? And that's uncomfortable. And it's not necessarily to say like take away from your respective strengths, but it's how do you create more seats at the table? I think that's the best way to think about it, right? Because I think the initial reaction or controversy that comes up around these DEI conversations is that it's this immediate like, oh, but if you're going to give to them, that's taking away from me, right? And that creates a bad dynamic in trying to actually address the real problem or challenge, which is we want everyone to be more successful and more seats at the table, right? So I think that's first just acknowledging, because there's always going to be that initial reaction, right? And the reality is diversity is going to look different in different communities. Our mandate is how do we get dollars flowing to all parts of the province, and the reality of the demographic makeup here versus in the Kootenays versus in up north are going to be different. So, is it fair or appropriate that we expect that everyone has the same level of diversity everywhere uniformly? No. And I think that should still be okay. But I think what's really helpful and tangible is being able to collect the data, right? And there's also a lot of people pushing back on like, well, that's privacy, all these things. And you can anonymize. Obviously, if you're much smaller of an organization, it's a lot harder to do that. But at an aggregate, how do you anonymize? Because ultimately, without the data, you don't have insights as to where the problems or challenges are, right? Or if there are even challenges or problems is probably a better way to frame it, right? But if you don't know, you're only making assumptions, and then it becomes a slippery slope of, well, there's no facts behind that, how can we do anything to move the needle? Like visibly, we can see on the stage what we look like, but how do you transpose that to all the organizations? And how do you action that, right? So, for example, as investors, the BDC rolled out 2 years ago now a DEI survey that all of the funds they invest in and the companies they invest in help to fill out, just so that we get a sense of what it is, right? We hear it's bad, but how do you know if you don't have the data? And there was a lot of pushback when that was originally released because, for all the reasons of like companies are small, people felt uncomfortable, and quite frankly, some people just felt bad because they knew their statistics were terrible and they didn't want to report on that, right? But if you can step back and think about like the data is just data. It's not to cast judgment. It's just to inform. Okay, what are we starting with, and then figure out what the challenges are, right? Is it we need to build more of a funnel that helps create more talent that will be ready, right? Do we need to create a training program? Do we have to think about other ways? Are we just not looking in the right places for entrepreneurs, right? Because if we're just relying on our own networks and over time they get homogenous, maybe we're not finding those entrepreneurs that are outside of our core network, right? And then, as employers, one of the other tactical things you can think about is like, as you hire and design your recruiting, how do you reduce the barriers there, right? I think there was a Harvard study that said, if there's a job description, 10 items, if a man has 3 of those 10 items, he's like, yes, I can get the job. And if a woman sees that she has 7 or 8 of those items, she's like, ugh, I'm not sure, right? So how do you change that and encourage more folks to, especially women or even visible minorities, to take that leap, right, to do that? But even salary transparency, that's another thing California has done, right, is mandated to do that because it levels the playing field, right? So when we were recruiting, we did that, right? I refused coffee chats, and what we did instead was we did info sessions. So that way, one, I could scale my time because I can't do 100 coffee chats, but 2, it allows everyone who doesn't already know me or a friend of mine to have the same access to that information, right? So there's really tactical things that, each of us can do. It doesn't have to be the big, like, okay, I must now convert my board or my staff to exactly this ratio. But there's things that you can do to move on that path, because everyone's starting at a different point, and that's okay. As long as you're starting and you have the intention to improve on that, then I think that's the key.
So Leah, I agree with you. I think but it requires tremendous amount of education, yes, and also really bring it to light, like actually highlighting a problem, because if people don't know about it, they just won't be incentivized to do it. But I also think if there is an incentive to create more diversity, that's actually quite helpful.
Well, the incentive is ultimately better performance, right? But I think that's the real incentive, but people get distracted and think that it's just lip service, and as long as I look like a Benetton, United Colors of Benetton ad, then I'm okay, right? And that's not the core, because actually it does a disservice if you're putting people there who aren't qualified, right? And it's not to say that they're not qualified, but sometimes there's that knee-jerk reaction of like, oh, I'm trying to do this, right? So the real long-term solution, if you're really bought in, is that these people will all bring different perspectives and experiences to help with those blind spots, right? That's the goal you should be working towards, not just filling the checkbox for the sake of it, right?
Wonderful.
I mean,
sorry,
really,
Todd. Go ahead.
Really actionable. So I agree. There's a space for everything. I think there is a space for mandates to get things going faster, but it is a diversity of experience and perspective, and it might not be the most traditional ways where traditionally people have gotten to those places. So it's to figure out how you do advance people with the different perspectives to get at the table you need them at, right? And you're not gonna have all the answers, so sometimes you need other people to hold it up and say, you're missing something here, right? Oh, you're right, exactly. And
you know, when we go fundraising now, I've noticed investors actually comment on it. We really like your diversified management. And I can say in Life Sciences BC, we've actually are trying to be a lot more, have a lot more EDI in our board. At least the last few years I've been joining, trying to have more women in minor, because it is, their input does make a big difference. It needs to represent who we are as a society.
Thank you. Wonderful. I'm going to shift gears a little bit. I wanted to go back to something, a point that Ali made around how we mobilized for the COVID crisis. And as a counterpoint, I want to touch on the opioid crisis, which we've had for 7 or 8 years at least. And it's such an, it's obviously a terrible crisis that we're experiencing both locally as well as across other communities in North America and other parts of the world. But why do we still have an opioid crisis, which is a human health crisis as well as a social justice crisis? So we faced COVID head on and mobilized enormous resources worldwide. Why do we still have an opioid crisis in our midst?
Well, I wish I was more prepared for this question. No, well, I mean, if you look at the historic, it has to do with the way we're developing new therapeutics or drugs. I don't know if you guys remember, about 20 years ago, there was a new drug developed by Merck called Vioxx. It was a COX-2 inhibitor, pretty powerful, it worked. But they found out that once the drug rolled out and millions of people used it, in fact, I used it a couple of times, it wasn't addictive. A few people had cardiovascular issues. Merck pulled back that drug. We actually don't have that many new mechanisms of action for pain drugs. To develop a new pain drug is expensive because what they call 50% of pain is psychosomatic. So you have to do a large enough trial for your p-value to be small enough to say, okay, is this psychological, is this real pain, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, the way medicine has fast forward 20 years, we're now doing drugs based on specific biomarkers that we really have a good understanding, and we target very specific patients. So 20 years ago, when I started my career, they were all small molecules, and small molecules are cheap to make, and they target many things. 4 of those top 10 best-selling drugs 20 years ago were in depression and pain. Today, and the top 10 best-selling drugs in the world targeted about 10% of global population. Fast forward to today, 7 or 8 of these drugs are now large molecules, and they target very specific things in your body. And they target less than 1% of the global population, but they make 10 times of what they did of those 10 best-selling drugs. So part of it is there hasn't been an advance in innovation in pain. And unfortunately, you guys have seen The Pharmacist, I don't know if you've seen it on Netflix, bunch of people at Purdue took advantage of it. Mm-hmm. And that's the problem. But I think the other part of opioid issue is that we have a massive problem in our society with mental health that we're not talking about. It's very difficult to address. I'll share with you all, I have a close family member that has a mental health issue, and it is highly stigmatized. So if I have cancer, I'll have loved ones come to me, and I want to get the best cancer treatment. Someone who has a mental health issue, a lot of times they don't realize they have a mental health issue. They don't want help, and they get isolated. So for opioid crisis, I think we need, treatments that are not addictive, like opioid is. We need better control, but also it's a massive mental health issue that our society needs to tackle on head on.
I'll build off of what you said, because I agree, the stigmatization of it is a huge barrier for folks who are suffering to be able to get treatment and support. And then I think on top of that is our system, like our healthcare system is not, in the US, is not set up to support people with these solutions, right? So when I was at TELUS Pollinator Fund, we actually invested in a company called pocket naloxone. So they're trying to bring a lower cost, easier to use form of naloxone that will be over the counter, so much easier to access, and wouldn't require an injection, right? But the barriers for them to go to market are tremendous, right? Because, and not just them, there's other solutions locally that are being developed, like Brave Co-op, like, what's the other, I can see his head in my face, Dr. Kim. Yeah. Definity, right? And so those are other solutions. Those two are homegrown solutions. Pocket naloxone's based out of Bethesda, Maryland. But there are solutions that are out there, but for them to get to market, so any of the ones that are a therapeutic have to go through Health Canada or FDA, right? So the cycles to do that take a long time, right? And it's capital intensive and resource intensive, right? For Brave, for example, who is their buyer? It's not the user, right? It's the facilities that would install these sensors. And so the challenge is then who's paying for that? Like who's paying for the benefit of saving these lives, right? And so it goes back to incentives for the system. What can we do? And we as a collective, not we, just the folks here on the stage, to think about different ways to reduce these barriers for these startups to innovate in this space and to get their products to market and scale, right? But at the end of the day, someone has to pay for that, right? And some of it is based on, government buyers, but are there other people that can help to be a customer? Because selling to government is really hard. If anyone's thinking of doing that, it's really hard. It's worth doing, but it's really hard, right? So you have to think about, well, what are different models that can help bring these things to life, right?
Thank you. Wonderful. We do have some Slido questions, so I want to turn it over to the audience. I am going to cherry pick some questions, but we've been talking a lot about life science. Let's shift gears to climate and clean tech. So the US and China are the world's largest CO2 emitters. What needs to What needs to change in innovation to influence these countries to reduce their, I'm assuming it says, to reduce their emissions? So what needs to change in innovation or influence, or to influence these countries to reduce their massive emissions on an annual basis?
Okay, an easy one.
We're talking foreign policy now.
Yeah,
so.
just foreign policy. So I'll pick up a couple of themes from earlier, but I mean, China. So a lot of the renewable tech and their adoption of renewables is at an incredible pace, and we will need China for all that the rest of the world wants to do to continue to adopt clean energy. So they are doing a lot. Unfortunately, yeah, their energy demand continues to grow, and they use a lot of carbon-intense sources such as coal, et cetera, and that's going to take time. But two of the things we maybe talked about off the top that can help is the evolution of markets and pricing in externalities. There's also pieces of the Paris Accord, Article 6, around ITMOs. So actually when we provide Canadian LNG or another Canadian product, that those benefits of that more less carbon intense source can then be attributed to the economics of something produced here. So there's, those are aspirational hopes. But I mean, China, the technology as far as scaling some of the ideas maybe that do come from other places in the world, they will be incredibly important, both on their technology, but their ability to mobilize stuff through their society too. So it's a bit of we need everything everywhere all at once. And just because it looks like things are insurmountable, I choose to look at what can we do, what can BC do, and what is happening. And ultimately, when we look out there, there's a huge space for innovation and in clean tech. But there'll be other things that we can't see right now, right? And one of the things that CIC is looking at is where is the innovation needed in tomorrow to really help with some of the clean tech solutions? No, not just the companies and ideas that are here today, what is needed in the future? And when you talk about the ability to maybe have the oceans help with carbon dioxide removal, when we talk about all of the energy storage that's going to be required for grids to integrate high variability renewable energy. When we think about in BC the massive biomass, so what does a broader biocarbon economy look like for multiple uses of that feedstock? Like there's a lot we can do, and so I'm really looking to innovation to help unlock some of the solutions we don't know about yet, right? And that's super exciting too. But
great. Anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, probably the more simplistic thing is like a lot of our BC companies are building solutions that don't just benefit BC, but can benefit globally. So, helping them to not just prove it out here, but then tackle challenges in other parts of the world is another really meaningful way for us to be able to contribute to that without necessarily influencing foreign policy. So,
thanks for saving me there. Yes, scaling our solutions here for the world. Yeah.
Just as consumers, I think it would be good for us to know when we buy a product from Amazon that comes from China, what's the impact of that on climate?
Sure.
I think that education, because it's going to be very hard for us to say we're going to slap tariffs on products. I mean, we buy stuff, most of our stuff comes from China. So you can't just say I'm going to slap tariffs on. But if, as consumers, we can see that if I buy this product versus something else, that's going to fill up our landfill, it's going to create landfills, or it's going to create so much CO2 emissions. That education can impact probably some of that problem.
Yeah, I was going to suggest that the question, while it's a global question, we can bring it back down to regional and locally. So how do we affect behavioral change in the population to help to address our own reduction targets and things like that? So wonderful. I really like this question. How can public funding best help to attract the massive amounts of private capital required to scale in BC and deploy solutions in BC as they achieve commercialization? Fits in really nicely with what Todd was talking about in answering the last question. So how can public policy and public funding help to attract those massive amounts of capital required to keep our homegrown talent and keep our homegrown innovation here in BC?
I'll quickly speak to this because one of the challenges we have, just so you guys know, BC is the #1 place in all of Canada. It's probably one of the top 10 geographies across North America for developing healthcare innovation, especially biotech. We have the most number of billion-dollar-plus publicly traded companies out of BC. And with the advent of unfortunate COVID, we saw what BC innovation can do globally. It wasn't just that we did something for Canada. Everybody used those Pfizer, Moderna vaccine, which the enabling technology came out of UBC. But what I can tell you is we do not have a single venture capital firm that invests in a meaningful way, headquartered out of BC. Most of the funding for everything we do comes from US, and we get some funding from a couple of VCs out of Montreal or Toronto. So, for example, this is an article I wrote in Business in Vancouver. When AbCellera went public, there was, Doug Jansen, who I have a lot of respect for him. He was one of the few investors in BC that had put in meaningful capital in that company. Not a single Canadian VC, nobody from, we don't have a venture capital out of BC, but not a Canadian VC had invested. So when a company went public and did really well, 100% of those investors, majority of them were American. So this is something that either as a policy, and I'm hoping this is why you guys have been created and promoted to help, is that we have a phenomenal angel credit tax credit program, which gets the company going. It's like giving birth, and then there is nothing. It's Series A needs to come from US. or a couple of VCs from East. So that's something that needs to be addressed.
Right.
Yeah, and like I said, that's our origin story, is how do we grow the pool of capital that's available locally, right? Because companies need capital at different stages of growth. And some of it is dilutive capital, which is what ours is, but non-dilutive capital like what Todd and his team would provide, right? And so we were formed to really think about that. And so a big part of our mandate is, yes, supporting the companies, but also we've got a carve-out that's focused on how do we support the growth of more funds, right? It's growing the funds locally, but also attracting other people to set up shop here, right? So that they can invest in this ecosystem, because ultimately we need more than just in BC writing checks for this ecosystem to grow and thrive, right? Like we 500 million sounds like a lot, but it doesn't go very far. And our goal is to be an evergreen fund, which means we need to have different ways of generating that return back.
But Leah, it's not just investing; it's reaping the benefits.
I was going to add to that point.
It's not like you're just going to put in the money and just walk. It's not charity.
Exactly.
These companies, most of them do really, really well. There are people that put in a couple of $100,000 and walked away with tens of millions of dollars out of sellers. So it's not like, so these investments come back, and we as British Columbians will benefit.
Yes, and that, I totally agree with you, and that's why we want to grow the ecosystem, is if you have more of those investors locally based, one, they're flowing more capital to local companies, but two, when those returns come back, more of that stays in our province, right? BC companies receive the least amount of local capital across Canada, full stop, right? I think 19% of capital that goes into BC companies is local. I think the biggest chunk of it comes from outside of Canada, and then the rest of Canada, but the least amount of capital comes from BC investors. So, when we think about our mandate, not just supporting the companies, it's supporting funds who can grow to a point where they can invest and keep that money in this ecosystem and reinvest it over time, right? So when I talk about being evergreen, that's a big part of being evergreen, is getting the financial returns back, reinvesting it, and then having that grow further and further.
Exactly, I agree with what both of my panelists have said, but it is really taking on, public funding can really take on those high risk early stage investments and help grow those and learn from those, and to make them fit for Series A and different stages of funding that other funds that can come in, et cetera. So that's where we play, as that earlier high risk piece, yeah.
Absolutely. Just taking my moderator hat off and putting a panelist hat on. There's a massive translational gap when governments look to the publicly funded research institutes or institutions as fountains of innovation, which they truly are. There is just a paucity of resources to help to bridge that translational gap, and not just financial resources, but the likes of tech transfer offices and organizations like Entrepreneurship at UBC were also helping to fill a risk-reward gap and a talent and experience gap, where these opportunities are just so embryonic that they don't meet the risk-reward requirements for potential talent to come on board, such as we've seen in a number of ventures that we've supported. A2O won an Ignite grant yesterday with Natalie Dakers at the helm, and Avivo Bio is another great example where we've been able to attract talent to the team, or help to attract talent to the team. And so there is there's a real gap at the earliest stages, and of course, if we're not supporting the pipeline at the earliest stages, then the arguments for supporting the pipeline at the later stages become moot, because the pipeline starts to dry up and disappear. So anyway, I'll put my moderator hat back on.
But I think that's a really good point, right? Like, the ecosystem starts, like, I think you talked about giving birth, but it's like from infancy all the way through maturity, right? So we need public and private support across that full continuum in order for, our startups to grow up and be their own adults over time, right?
Absolutely. We had a little glitch with the Slido. I saw there was an error message saying that it lost connectivity, but we're back. And so I'm going to actually take this most recent question, because I think it's fantastic. How do you increase the risk tolerance of investors in Canada when they are potentially traditionally quite risk averse? Isn't it more of a mindset change? So is there a way to incentivize the risk tolerance in investors in Canada?
So I think we touched on it a little bit in terms of the public-private partnership, and not truly in the sense of a PPP, but working together to de-risk, right? And I think there's a lot of different programs, BCCICE, for example, SDTC as another example from a cleantech perspective, right? That's helping to try to de-risk and increase that risk tolerance for investors, right? But ultimately, it's also, well, what can we do to help with proof points, earlier proof points, right? And that goes a long way. So being able to show, like, you know, here's the plan and here's my traction against those plan, right? So that helps to get people to wrap their heads around that. I think part of it is education, I think, also of like understanding, like, you know, we're not looking at all just SaaS businesses. So the risk profile is gonna be different, and that's okay, but there's a reward that comes with that, right? And so it's, you know, finding different people who are willing to come to the table and take on that risk too.
Yeah, and I mean, when you engage with startup companies, like they're small amount of people so dedicated that they're just focused on their idea and opportunity, right? And our ability to elevate their story, help tell their story, provide those successes to help amplify and so other people within the funding ecosystem can really understand how they can play a role. That's another piece of the puzzle we think we can help with. But and to really, you know, shine the light across the funnel to understand where opportunities are and when they may be ripe for, you know, additional funding, and that may be, you know, in BC and additional funds that are funded. It's international delegations that are coming through the trade office that we can create opportunities for exposure to as well, which we do. It's all of those pieces, but it is also, it's not just the funding of companies. I think it's the additional resources that they can't dedicate to helping to tell their story and tell the story about BC where they play to.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. We could spend all afternoon. This has been wonderful. It's been fantastic and really, really enlightening. We are a little over time. I want to thank you all immensely for your contribution and your time today. I heard a number of themes that I just absolutely love and would love to action after Entrepreneurship Immersion Week. We need more collaboration. We need more cooperation. We need diversity of thought, inclusivity, and vulnerability. Measuring our success beyond just the dollars raised, but shifting how we measure the success in our innovation ecosystem. So thank you so much. Please join me in giving our panelists a round of applause.